Happy Black History Month from myself and Maree, and welcome to another Black Writer Wrap-Up. So the first book I want to talk about was actually a really challenging text for me to read, despite how short it was, and that is Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire. Now, I was first introduced to him at the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. In addition to being the largest collection of Dali paintings and sketches and drawings in the world, they also have rotating exhibits that feature other surrealist artists. In addition to being a politician and an author and an activist, Aimé Césaire was also a poet. And what was really fascinating to me about his exhibit was I was only familiar with surrealism prior to this visit as an art form. I thought about Marcel Duchamp and his toilet. I thought about, or not toilet, urinal. I thought about Frida Kahlo, although she argued that she was not a surrealist. I thought, of course, about Salvador Dali and all the beautiful images I saw in coffee books and on my dad's walls growing up. I did not realize, though, that there was a specific branch of surrealism that was heavily influenced and invested in politics. Surrealism wasn't just about the type of art that they created or the poems that they wrote or the pictures they took. Surrealism for them was a way of mind, a way of thinking, a way of moving through the world. And on the eve of World War I, they looked at surrealism as a way to prevent another global war. So Aimé Césaire was a surrealist who was also a philosopher and incorporated surrealism, philosophy, and politics to develop the movement of negritude. And negritude was an emphasis and celebration of Black history and African history. It was an anti-colonial movement, and Césaire, as someone from Martinique, a French colony, had a very complicated history with French colonization, going to a French university before eventually returning to Martinique to join the Communist Party and a variety of other political parties to try to achieve agency and freedom and independence for Martinique. So this book, this pamphlet really is a discourse on colonialism. He is attacking it. He is tearing it down. He is showing how the lies that we tell ourselves, and I say we because all of us have been taught in this colonialist framework about, oh yeah, those poor countries, they don't know how to use their resources. Or, oh, those countries, we're going to bring them trains and schools. Oh, those countries cannot manage themselves, cannot run themselves. They are better off being under our care, under our stewardship. And he really tears down all this ridiculous propaganda and rhetoric about brown and Black countries, about countries that have been viewed as places to take resources and take labor as opposed to independent sovereign nations. And there were some parts of this book that, to me, I will admit, felt a little like, oh yeah, we know that, but I know that's coming from a place of privilege because I'm reading this book in 2022, a time in which so many more countries have achieved their independence from the French, from the Belgians, from the British, than at the time in which this was written. In addition, these lies about colonialism are still very, very heavily influencing our education and our politics, and I fully admit that I'm still doing my internal work to decolonize my mind. In addition to being an intense text, it's also quite funny. Like, he has a sharp, biting wit, and you can tell in this nonfiction pamphlet that he is a poet. And the way that he talks about how colonialism destroys the colonizer as well as the colonized, the way that colonialism requires an individual to see his fellow man as a beast or as something less than, something separate than, and what that does to the psyche of an individual. Another thing I love about this text is that in talking about negritude, in talking about an embracing of Blackness and embracing of African traditions, there also were conversations about what is Blackness and what are those African traditions. Now, this book was very much focused on the colonialism, but it was still interesting to see that there were points where he was referencing other writers, points where he was referencing other politicians who argued certain things about Africa that he knew were not the case. The idea that Africa had no civilization, the fact that, I say fact because I'm thinking about his quotes, obviously it's not a fact, but the idea that Africa had no religion and Africa had no infrastructure, none of these things until these various European powers came in and carved up the continent. So he's also commenting and kind of responding to the other writers of his time. And one thing that I think is great about all books, but especially this book, is it made me want to go and read those other writers. It made me want to go read the writers that were inspired by him, that were his contemporaries. And it also put into perspective some of the ways in which I look at the relationship between art and politics. So for example, while I still very much love Dali's work and I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for his creations, I learned through this text and through doing research on these various movements of surrealism that Dali was very much like, yeah, this whole activism, anti-war, anti-colonialist, not my thing, not my bag. I'm gonna go to America and live big. I'm gonna ball out. I'm about making art and making money. And not to get in the whole separate the art from the artist type of mentality, but after all these years of enjoying surrealist art, and yes, enjoying the intersection between surrealism and communism, and surrealism and indigenous culture that I learned from Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, I'm really kind of frustrated with myself and a little frustrated with Dali in learning some of these things. So I think that this is a really hard book. I'll say hard in the sense that, you know, it's very clearly rooted in a specific time, and there were things I had to Google and search because I didn't understand the references, but a very, very interesting text. I can't think of, off the top of my head, I can't say this is something that I'd immediately reread, but I'm really grateful to it for opening a whole new world to me in regards to the intersections between surrealism and politics, in regards to the entire concept of negritude, which I had never heard about, learning about this French, Black, Martinican politician, philosopher, author, poet. Like, I definitely want to read his poetry. I definitely want to read more of his poetry. I got to read a little bit in the exhibit, and so I'm excited to kind of build on his text more. And I'm excited because this is a book that was originally written in French, and so I've been trying to read more translated texts. So that was the first book I read, Discourse on Colonialism. Another nonfiction text written by a Black author is We Will Not Cancel Us by Adrienne Maree Brown. Now, I have mentioned Adrienne Maree Brown multiple times in the past few videos, most specifically when I mentioned I was reading Pleasure Activism. But unlike Pleasure Activism, which is a thick one, We Will Not Cancel Us is quite short and is actually a kind of a reimagining, editing, a digging deeper on ideas that she explored in a blog post. And one of the things I loved about this book, before I even get into the actual content, was that she explicitly acknowledged the writing process of the initial blog post, the feedback that she got from positive sources, the feedback that she got from negative sources, and she stated in the introduction the things that she changed and the things that she didn't. And I love that. To me, it was a beautiful example in black and white on paper of intellectual humility. It was a beautiful example of acknowledging that different people coming from different backgrounds are going to view things different ways. And sometimes you look at it and realize this needs to edit, this needs to change and adapt in order to more accurately tell the message I want to tell. And in other ways, be like, no, this really is what I meant. This tension that we've experienced because of this, it has been helpful, but I'm sticking to this. I feel like we don't see that. I feel like this idea of expert culture that we have, where no one ever wants to admit they're wrong, or no one ever wants to change for fear of being called a hypocrite or inauthentic or a sellout, it's baffling. So I'm gonna put that aside, but that was in the introduction and I loved it. And We Will Not Cancel Us, honestly, I think you should read it in conjunction. Read it in conjunction with So You've Been Publicly Shamed, because We Will Not Cancel Us was very much written in this moment, and you can tell just by the language of cancellation, but also in the ways that she breaks down how cancellation happens within movements, how cancellation happens beyond movements, the speed in which cancellation happens, and how that can affect the role of the mediator or the facilitator or the person who believes in transformative justice. And one of the most valuable things I got from this book were her individual definitions of words. This may sound so simple, but I have found, and she has found in her work, that sometimes people are talking past each other when they think they're talking about the same thing, whether it's sexism or whether it's higher education. They're really talking about two completely different concepts, but they think they're on the same page, so they never take the time to sit down and define things. One of my favorite parts of this book is she gives her definitions for the difference between a mistake, between conflict, between abuse, between harm, between accountability. Those words often become synonyms. Those words are often weaponized. And she talked about how in her role as a mediator and a facilitator and an activist and an organizer, getting on the same page about what those specific words mean and defining the situation that they're in is the best way to move forward. Because there is a difference between a mistake and there's a difference between a conflict. There's a difference between a conflict and abuse. And sometimes in the online space, these words can be flattened. These situations can be flattened. And I feel like I talked about this a little bit in my video about So You've Been Publicly Shamed. Like, there's a huge range between someone using the inappropriate word to refer to an indigenous tribe a mistake versus someone with a history of abuse. And also there's a difference between someone being uncomfortable and someone experiencing harm. And yes, those words can be subjective, and I'm not necessarily arguing that her definitions are the only definitions one should use, but I really appreciated the way that she gave like paragraphs, like thick pieces of text to define these seemingly simple words that often get conflated in conversation. Another thing I loved about this book was that how do I phrase this? While I've worked in anti-racist spaces for a long time, they have been pockets within larger organizations, pockets within larger, predominantly white organizations. And so as such, my experience in the movement, it has been limited to that. I have never worked at a theater that is run predominantly by people of color, or I've never worked at an organization that the entire mission is like anti-racism or activism. And the reason I bring that up is because as someone who has, Adrienne Maree Brown has done that, she brought up something I had never considered, which is the way that cancellation can intentionally be weaponized against the movement. She was talking about situations in which people were leaking notes from meetings, situations in which people were intentionally passing rumors and gossip along in order to break up leadership of an organization. She talked about the dangers in cancellation, the dangers and when it comes to immediate public call outs of individuals, when you have people within organizations going at each other and people who are working in the same field attacking each other, and how that all weakens us, how these tactics of public online cancellation can also be used by the state to surveil these organizations. And yes, I was aware of Counsel Pro. Yes, I was aware of the FBI practice of claiming that someone was an informant in order to sow distrust and discord inside an activist group. I was aware of those things like in a historical context, but I never thought about the damage that truly can be done to the credibility of an organization, or the damage that can be done to the momentum of a movement when an individual gets called out. And that is not to say that just because someone works in an anti-racist space or someone works in a community organizing space, that means they're incapable of harm. That is not to say that it means that they're incapable of making mistakes. That is not to say that conflict is impossible. But there absolutely are situations that I've watched from the outside that have been like, yeah, something's going on there, but whatever's going on, it is definitely distracting from this mission, or it is definitely distracting from this call to action. And so to hear someone who works on the ground and in those organizations explicitly name, hey, let's not do our enemy's dirty work for us. Hey, let's be mindful of the ways that our good intentions around wanting to root out harm in these spaces can sometimes weaken our overall mission. And for those like her who are very invested in transformative justice, how are we applying transformative justice in our interpersonal conflicts, as well as the way, in the same way that we talk about transformative justice when we talk about the large scale of like the prison industrial complex or ICE or things of that nature. Again, once you look at these two books, you will see that they are incredibly thin, but come on, like, what's the phrase? Quality over quantity. So much to think about. Discourse on Colonialism and We Will Not Cancel Us are short books that, similar to The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, you could highlight every page in my opinion. And although I totally understand what it feels like to have a TBR list a mile long, if you're looking for a quick, intense, brilliant nonfiction read, I would start with We Will Not Cancel Us. Discourse on Colonialism has so much value as well, but if you're not really interested in negritude, if you're not interested in surrealism, if you're not interested in that time period, it may be a little hard to connect with. We Will Not Cancel Us should be required reading, in my opinion. Whether or not you agree with her definitions of the words, just the way that you can see her practice as a mediator and a facilitator broken down on the page, love it, love it. And the last book I wanted to talk about, the longest of the books that I read by Black authors, and actually the book that I would say has started me on a path to learning the most, even though I have been learning a lot from Aimé, Césaire, and Adrienne Maree Brown, is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. So The Sum of Us is really interesting because it is basically giving an overview of the history of the United States and a critique and analysis of where we are now in terms of race relations, but as it's related to public policy. So while I'm someone who feels like pretty comfortable with certain historical facts around chattel slavery and the 3/5 compromise, Jim Crow laws, sundown towns, moving into de jure and de facto segregation and redlining, and the way that the GI Bill was intentionally not applied to Black veterans who could get those benefits if they were white. How the development of the suburbs and the New Deal and various FDR acts, again, helped build a white middle class, but left everyone in the dust. Like, I feel pretty comfortable with that timeline, but I had no idea about the connection in the history between public goods and public policy around welfare and Medicaid and Social Security, around community pools, around public universities, around libraries and parks, and the history of race in America. And what Heather's basic thesis is one, you can look at the history of public goods and public policy in this country and explicitly see the places in which the entire country has suffered. All races, all ethnicities have suffered because individuals and politicians and political bodies and state governments and federal governments would rather pull out support, pull out money, pull away from any type of mandate or policy or physical good that could benefit everyone. So to give a very clear example, on the cover of her book, there is an image of a boy jumping into the pool. And she starts with the history of public pools in this country, which I had no idea about. I had no idea that there are these huge, massive, gorgeous pools. And the whole goal of them was to have a safe place to relax in the summer, a place where people from various backgrounds and ethnicities, speaking specifically of white ethnicities, and economic stature could come together and join together in some good American fun. Once those pools started to be desegregated, there were entire, just like huge caverns in the earth all over the United States that were drained of their pools. People would rather drain the pool than integrate it. People would rather drain the pool and take away that resource for everyone than allow Black people to take part in it. And she showed over and over and over again how that continued to happen. She also introduced me to so much amazing research about public goods that you may think should be colorblind. Like when she looked at the number of public universities and libraries and green space and parks and open galleries and just, things that support an entire community in areas that were prior to the Civil War, areas with a lot of slave populations, and then areas without that, she saw, and other people found research that showed that, wow, these areas in which they don't view everyone as people, areas in which people lived on plantations where they consolidated all their wealth and they consolidated all their resources, those areas had less public goods for all of the people, specifically in this case, the white people who didn't have property, who weren't educated, who didn't own human beings. They had no resources. They had no public goods, because why would the land-holding wealthy class, slave-owning class, invest any sort of money or resources in making the entire community, the entire city or town better when they had everything they needed on their plantation? But you had other places that where slaveholding was not the economic backbone that had to invest in these things because they saw they needed a more educated population. They needed a population that could read. They needed a population that had hard skills. They needed a population that knew how to labor and how to work in various trades. And so the rates of literacy, the rates of general health, the rates of innovation are drastically different even today between the North and the South, and a lot of that can be traced back to slavery. Now she goes much further throughout history. She talks about voting rights and the development of the middle class. She talks about home ownership. Like, it's a really, really great overview of a lot of key issues in the United States, issues that affect everybody. Why can't I afford to go to college? Why can't I buy a home? Why am I drowning under these medical bills? And looks at the lack of social care, the lack of systems that are supposed to support and uphold everyone's lives, and see how racism is one of the main reasons that we cannot have nice things. So she starts in her introduction like, why can't we have nice things? And then breaks down what those nice things are. And one thing that I find hopeful about this text is that she introduces us to the idea of the solidarity dividend. What do we gain? What is the dividend when we come together? And she gives examples of pockets of communities, whether it was around economic revival, whether it was around voting, whether it was around union rights and factories, where people from different races, different ethnicities, different backgrounds have come together and won. When they have come together and have explicitly named how racism has been used to divide us and have pushed against everything that the wealthy, land-owning, I'm going to say it, exploitative classes have been trying to do to the rest of us, have done to the rest of us. Whether it's, getting safer worker conditions in your environment, whether it's investing more in resources like public resources like libraries and parks for your kids, whether it's minimum wage, raising the hourly minimum wage. She gives these very specific case studies in which a multicultural coalition, a multiracial coalition, a multi-citizenship status coalition wins. We win when we join together. We are stronger together. And acknowledging the racism that is present in our current system and acknowledging the racism that is explicitly used to keep us apart, specifically poor white people and immigrants and people of color apart. We have a long history of doing very great things when we join together and a long history of not getting as far when we are divided apart. So these are 3 books that I've read in the past few months, all nonfiction, all have been excellent. I'd recommend all of them, but especially We Will Not Cancel Us and The Sum of Us. Those are the 2 that, especially for like Americans, I would highly, highly recommend reading. And I want you to know that The Sum of Us, while it is a longer book than the other 2, you'll see it's much thicker. She is an excellent writer. Heather McGhee does not make it dry. She doesn't make it dense. And by the way that she weaves in case studies and public policy statistics and interviews with experts and personal stories, it makes the pace really, really nice. And even if you're someone who's not really into nonfiction, I do think The Sum of Us and We Will Not Cancel Us are quite accessible texts. Discourse on Colonialism, little bit harder to work through. I definitely had to Google some things, maybe need a little bit more help on that one. Still think it's worth reading, but I wouldn't necessarily start there. So those are just a few books that I have read over the past couple weeks. I also want to say thank you to everyone who commented and gave your feedback and advice in my last video about how BookTube isn't bad for my reading. That was kind of a vulnerable video for me, and I was genuinely surprised at the great insight and advice and just like, you all were just very, very kind. So I appreciate that. I got some good ideas from that comment section. So you'll probably see more what I'm reading right now videos. You'll probably see a Friday Reads video. And you're definitely gonna see some more random book wrap-ups because you all were very, very vocal about how I don't need to feel pressure to make everything fit a theme, which honestly, it has been one of my biggest insecurities the past few months. So happy Black History Month once again. I hopefully will not be too long in seeing you, trying to keep this going while I'm in my last semester of school. And as always, I hope you have a good one. Bye.